Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
The United States marked Veterans Day on Tuesday with a series of events nationwide. Speaking at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said honoring the nation's troops includes questioning the policies that send them to war.
The wall reminds us to be honest in our telling of history. There's nothing to be gained by glossing over the darker portions of a war, the Vietnam War, that bitterly divided America. We must openly acknowledge past mistakes. And we must learn from past mistakes, because that is how we avoid repeating past mistakes. The rule reminds us that we must never take the security of our country for granted, ever. And we must always question our policies that send our citizens to war, because our nation's policies must always be worthy of the sacrifices we ask of the men and women who defend our country.
That was Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel yesterday. Well, we turn now to a retired three-star U.S. general who helped command troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Lieutenant General Daniel Bolger has just published a book titled Why We Lost, a general's inside account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He writes, quote, "I am a United States Army general and I lost the global war on terrorism." It's like Alcoholics Anonymous. Step one is admitting you have a problem. Well, I have a problem. So do my peers. And thanks to our problem, now all of America has a problem. To wit, 2 lost campaigns and a war gone awry.
In a piece published this week in the New York Times headlined "The Truth About Wars," General Bolger called for a public inquiry along the lines of the 9/11 Commission to look into why the 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have gone so poorly. To find out more, we're joined by General Daniel Bolger, served 35 years in the U.S. Army before retiring last year, commanded the Coalition Military Assistance Training Team in Iraq 2005-6, the 1st Cavalry Division in Baghdad 2009-10, and the NATO training mission in Afghanistan from 2011 to 13. His military awards include 5 bronze medals, including 1 for valor, and the Combat Action Badge. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Thanks very much, Amy. Well,
how did the U.S. lose the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think the simplest way to say it is that we misapplied the forces of our armed forces. We didn't use them in the way that they're trained and prepared. You know, now Secretary Chuck Hagel, a Vietnam veteran, like his brother, served together in the 9th Infantry Division in Vietnam. His statement there is very powerful. You've got to have a public debate before you commit American military forces. We did have that after 9/11, but it was very rushed. We had that again in 2002 before we went into Iraq. We never continued the debate. The initial phases of both wars went successfully from a military standpoint, but we never followed it up by having a discussion. Is it appropriate to send thousands of young American men and women into foreign countries to go house to house and try and sort out who's a terrorist, who's a villager? That's something we tried in Southeast Asia, and it didn't work. And yet we repeated it once in Afghanistan and then again in Iraq. And that's very disturbing. And I think that led directly to our failure in both campaigns.
The surge in Iraq?
The surge in Iraq was the word is what it means. A surge is a temporary measure. And it was a temporary increase in troops. The best way I would sort of use an analogy is if a patient is ill and has a fever, you can give them a lot of aspirin and bring the temperature down. But when you stop giving the aspirin, the underlying fever is still there. So the surge in Iraq gave some temporary relief, and then we did a surge in Afghanistan as well in 2009, 10, 11. But it wasn't permanent, and it didn't solve the underlying problem, which is to say that both countries have an insurgency, and the solution to those insurgencies, if there's going to be a solution, rests in the hands of the Iraqis and the Afghans.
But the enormous amount not only of casualties that occurred on the U.S. side as well as the Iraqi side in the war, and then this enormous buildup of an Iraqi army trained by the United States that then essentially disintegrated with the rise of ISIS. How did that happen?
Well, while we shouldn't be surprised by that, the old Iraqi army, we'd fought them twice in 91 and 2003. They also disintegrated when we came into contact with them. ISIS had the similar experience. It takes many decades to build a decent army. And a few years of training, a couple days at the rifle range, some marching around is not going to do the trick. We've had experience building armies in other countries. I think particularly the South Koreans, who did not do all that well in the Korean War of 1950 to 53, but now have an army capable of defending their country and, in fact, going around the world and doing United Nations missions. South Korean troops served in both Iraq and Afghanistan and served with distinction. But that was an effort of decades. And it does not require hundreds of thousands of troops. It doesn't require fleets of jet bombers. It requires a small number of trainers and a long-term commitment to a solution that the people of that country, the Afghans and the Iraqis, want.
Now, you state in your book that the United States military is essentially not prepared to mount counterinsurgency wars. Conventional wars is one thing, but the counterinsurgencies is a whole other world. Could you expand on that?
I could. I think our challenge is we're very good at conventional wars. In fact, we were so good at it that myself and other commanders thought this time we're going to fight Vietnam and get it right, because our quality young men and women, so brave, so tough, so well supported by the American people with equipment, training, and their families, we thought this time we're going to pull it off. And we missed the fundamental strategic error of that thought, and it's an error based in arrogance, hubris, whatever word you want to use. And that is, by their nature, when a country is having a problem with rebels or with insurgents, the solution must lie with the local people. The solution will be partially political in nature. There may be a violent component to it. There may be deals cut. But it's not something that hundreds of thousands of American or Western troops can solve, no matter how well they're trained at military skills. So I think we missed a fundamental strategic point there. And I know I definitely blame myself. I'm concerned about my own failings in that area, because I studied Vietnam in the Army War College and in the other Army schools. I knew what we'd done wrong there. And in my arrogance, I made the error, along with many of my peers, of thinking, well, this time, because our troops are better, we might pull it off. It doesn't change the fundamentals on the ground.
You have called a commission to look at the flaws of what happened. You've called for a kind of commission. In June, we spoke to Richard Clarke, the nation's top former counterterrorism official. He said he believes George W. Bush is guilty of war crimes for launching the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He served as national coordinator for the security and counterterrorism during Bush's first year in office. He resigned in 2003 following the Iraq invasion. This is a part of his response, whether George Bush should be held on war crimes, should be tried for war crimes.
I think things that they authorized probably fall within the area of war crimes. Whether that would be productive or not, I think, is a discussion we could all have. But we have established procedures now with the International Criminal Court in The Hague where people who take actions as serving presidents or prime ministers of countries have been indicted and have been tried. So the precedent is there to do that sort of thing.
Richard Clarke went on to say that then President George Bush had wanted him to place the blame for 9/11 on Iraq.
I resigned, quit the government altogether, testified before congressional committees and before the 9/11 Commission, wrote a book revealing what the Bush administration had and had not done to stop 9/11. And what they did after the fact, how the president wanted me after the fact to blame Iraq for the 9/11 attack.
That was Richard Clarke, one former top counterterrorism czar. Your response?
Well, I would tell you, I don't know that war crimes or that is in order. I don't have enough knowledge about those aspects. I will tell you, though, where Richard Clarke's on very firm ground is the seriousness and the importance of a public hearing as to what went wrong in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, if you go back to the Korean War that I mentioned earlier, in 1951 there were major hearings. We called in MacArthur, who'd been fired by that time, the general in the theater. He came and testified. Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State. Pretty much everybody but President Truman testified in front of those congressional hearings. Senator Fulbright called similar hearings during the Vietnam War, and in that case the field commander, General William Westmoreland, did come back and testify. Where are those hearings on this war? Where is the similar event? People like Richard Clarke need to be called in so that they can explain fully what they know, and then it can be corroborated and put to the full light of day. So the American people then can say, through their elected representatives, hey, we think this is a good idea, we want you to stick with it and train these guys, or hey, this has not worked out, let's do something different. But the key thing we need is a public hearing. The last public vote on war or peace in Iraq or Vietnam was in October of 2002 with the use of authorization for use of force for Iraq. Other than that, there's just been the annual budgets, and despite a lot of rhetoric, every year that budget gets approved.
I wanted to ask about the whole issue that you raised, not only of what has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but how the branding of the war on terrorism has expanded to so many other countries, some of which Americans don't know anything about. You mentioned that just the label, Operation Enduring Freedom, there was an OEF in CCA in the Caribbean and Central America, OEF HOA in the Horn of Africa, OEF K in Kyrgyzstan, OEF P in the Philippines. This, given the fact that so many Arab and Muslim countries have now been targeted for this expansion of our war on terrorism, how do you, as a general, as a military man, deal with this perception, growing perception in the Arab and Muslim world that there is almost a civilizational battle between the West and their region of the world?
It's obviously a great concern, and remember, we should not forget, when we speak of this as Americans, the primary victims so far of the war on terrorism, the Iraq and Afghanistan campaign, have been the Iraqis and the Afghans. We've caused some of that. We didn't mean to. I can tell you, we tried very hard to prevent civilian casualties, but when you use modern weapons, you can't always be that careful. And especially when you're trying to pick out an enemy who's wearing civilian clothes. It's just very difficult. The enemy has also inflicted casualties on their own populations, and these are civil wars in many ways. So the primary victims of this war on terrorism numerically have been from the Arab and Muslim world. You would think there'd be common cause, that we could get together and find some ground where we could agree on who is the enemy here and what to go after. And that's where I think we've really had a challenge, because we don't hold those meetings either. We tend to stay very focused on threats to the American homeland. I'm glad we are. I don't want to see another 9/11 here or any attack like that. It's horrific. But as a result, we end up in a lot of places with our intelligence entities and with our special forces chasing a lot of people.
Do you have to be retired, General, to say something like this?
No, and I'm glad you asked that, Amy. Believe it or not, and Secretary Hagel is a good example of that. When we close the doors and have a meeting in the military or with members of government, I've met with Secretary of Defense Hagel, I've met with his predecessor, Secretary Panetta, his predecessor, Secretary Gates, his predecessor, Secretary Rumsfeld, Secretaries Rice, Kerry, etc. We get to have our say with all those people. And when the door's closed, we can be very honest about what we think or don't think. But there is a tradition of civilian control of the military in the United States, and when the decision's made, you salute and carry out that decision. Once the door opens, that is the decision that you carry out to the best of your ability. And if you can't carry it out, then you have to do like Richard Clark and say, okay, I can no longer work in this organization.
Can you talk a little bit about your personal experiences as a commander, when particular incidents that really drove home to you the failures of our policies and of our efforts in those areas?
When I was first there in 2005, in the spring of 2005 in Iraq, my duties involved going out with both U.S. and Iraqi forces. And I would go out into the villages, and it was very obvious almost immediately that as much as we've tried to develop intelligence and try to figure out who's who, you're going into a village where the notification of the target individual you're looking for, it says, 40-plus-year-old male, name is Mohammed. Well, in a village of 1,000 people, there's 500 who could answer to that description. And you're trying to sort out, so you're going into homes, you're going into marketplaces, you're going into schools, trying to figure out who's the enemy. You don't speak the language, so you're working through your Iraqi counterparts and all this. And it became painfully obvious to me that as the armed forces of a superpower, if this is what we were reduced to, we were following the wrong policy. This was not a fight that we should be doing. And I think it's a very legitimate fight for the Iraqis to determine the future of their country, or the Afghans. We can help them, but they have to take the lead. And I believe when they take the lead, what we've seen is they use a much larger political component. They cut deals, they make arrangements, they bring people in. They don't feel like they have to hunt down and kill everybody.